Okay, hello everyone. Welcome. My name is Rachel Jacobson. I am the Deputy Director at American Society of Adaptation Professionals. I use she, her pronouns, and I am calling in today from Ann Arbor, Michigan, lands of the Anishinaabe and Wyandot peoples. And I am so thrilled that you've all joined us for the next installment in our co-creation webinar series. And we're thrilled to be co-hosting this webinar with Arise US. You will hear more about them in just a minute. Today's session is in our ARC on global adaptation action, building equity through collaboration before crisis. And again, thank you so much to our co-host, Arise US. And as we get started, I want to invite everyone to introduce themselves in the chat here. We'd love to know who you are and where you're calling in from. So just a quick note on some tech items. So please remain muted throughout the webinar. And if you could check right now to make sure you're on mute and put yourself on mute. If you are not, that would be wonderful. Feel free to keep your camera on or keep your camera off. We love seeing you if you'd like to have your camera on. We would love for you to use the Zoom chat, again, both to introduce yourself right now, to ask any questions, to keep the conversation going with one another. If you need direct tech support, please message in the Zoom chat, send a private message to Beth Gibbons or Megan Putnam. And I want to give a shout out to Beth Gibbons, our executive director here at ASAP, and Megan Putnam, our program assistant, who are here today supporting the webinar. We're going to have a Q&A at the end of our session, and if you have a direct question for one of our panelists, please submit that question via the Slido platform. We'll share that information in the chat in just a minute for how to access Slido. And again, feel free to chat Beth or Megan if you need any support throughout the webinar. Again, just a reminder, please send any questions for our panelists through Slido, and we'll send the Slido link in the chat now. So I will give a brief introduction to ASAP and to our webinar series, and then I'm going to turn it over to our partners at Arise US to share about their organization and network as well before we move into our main event for today, which is, of course, our wonderful panel. So American Society of Adaptation Professionals, we connect and support climate change adaptation and climate resilience professionals to better address climate change impacts. ASAP members are building essential climate resilience for communities, ecosystems, and economies across North America. And here at ASAP, we help members strengthen their professional networks, exchange best practices and practical advice, and accelerate innovation, all leading to more equitable and effective climate adaptation practice. And at ASAP, for us, it's really all about the people and the relationships between those people. These are just a few of the folks at ASAP who are inspiring one another every day to do critical adaptation work on the ground. And here at ASAP, we define an adaptation professional as anyone who uses future climate information in their day-to-day work. That includes everyone from engineers and architects to activists and educators. And the strength of our network is in its sectoral and regional diversity. So we have ASAP members spread all across the US, in several Canadian provinces, in the UK and in Australia. And we have folks working in all sectors, public sector, for-profit companies, nonprofits, academia, providing climate adaptation services at all scales. And ASAP really believes that we all have something to learn from one another, and we can make better change when we come together across all of those different contexts. ASAP's work is made possible through funding we receive from member dues, including dues from individuals and organizations. And here are our current organizational members who extend ASAP membership to their staff, clients, and colleagues, and ensure that they have a hand in both building the adaptation field and benefiting from the resources and knowledge that come from ASAP membership. Our programs here at ASAP are all designed to build the capacity of our members to do equitable and effective adaptation work on the ground. So we have ASAP Connects, where folks come together to meet new people and explore new ideas across the adaptation landscape. Adaptation Careers, where we help folks excel in their current jobs through education and training opportunities and find new work. Adaptation Voices, which is all about lifting up stories of innovative adaptation work that's happening on the ground and inspiring adaptation action. And then ASAP Serves, which is an opportunity for members to give back and show leadership within the adaptation field. And our co-creation webinar series is both a training and learning opportunity, as well as an opportunity for us to lift up those stories of just incredible adaptation work from across sectors. So since 2020, ASAP has been collaborating with a whole host of partners to bring you the co-creation webinar series. And each webinar focuses on 3 themes: showcasing innovative adaptation work that is yielding tangible, replicable results, illustrating how collaboration across sectors enables that work, and describing how justice and equity principles can be integrated into adaptation action. You can catch previous co-creation sessions covering everything from sea level rise standards to adaptation finance to task force on climate financial disclosures, all on our YouTube channel. A link to that will be coming around in the chat in just a minute. And don't forget to register for our upcoming sessions in our 2022 series. So we have one more session in our global adaptation arc. That'll be on multilateral adaptation action. And then we'll have an arc on advancing the adaptation field, covering the adaptation workforce and measuring adaptation success. Oh.
Well, Rachel, I think I can pick it up from there.
On every vacation at a verbal home, there's someone like
Joyce Coffey, and I am the president and founder of Climate Resilience Consulting, which is a social enterprise based in Chicago. We are working in the land of the California Three Fires. And I'm also here representing Arise US. But before I get to them, I want to mention that Climate Resilience Consulting is an organizational member of American Society of Adaptation Professionals. And when Arise US was thinking about who could we partner with to have a really robust set of conversations around equity in the resilience field, the first and only answer to that question was Beth Gibbons and Rachel Jacobson at ASAP. So thank you all so much for the incredible work you do. And I'm really pleased that today we're going to be welcoming some extraordinary leaders to hear and learn from one another around how we can build equity through collaboration before crisis. And I don't know if Rachel, you want to go back and talk a little bit about Arise US, but I did want to mention that Arise US is here represented not only by myself, but also by fellow board members, Camilla Tapias, who you'll be hearing from in just a moment, an extraordinary expert in many things, and also Deborah Johnson, who is a longstanding board member of Arise US. Arise US is a membership organization, and our aim is to really increase the amount of private sector engagement in disaster risk response, recovery, and especially resilience. So I laugh at this slide because it's loaded with too many words, but it's so interesting because this is in fact a United Nations disaster risk reduction program, and the United Nations likes their words. So I sort of put this up here a little bit tongue in cheek. Although I also want to be very serious to say that Arise US is extremely committed to the work that we have carved out for ourselves. So next slide, please. Here are a few things that Arise is focused on right now. One is we really are looking to enhance the resilience of small and medium enterprises. And in a moment, I'll put some notes in the chat about some of the work we're doing in that regard. This is small and medium enterprises in North America and in other countries as well. We're really also focusing on how we can integrate disaster and climate risk into investment decisions. Rachel just mentioned the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, and there are many other means by which we can ensure that funding and finance flow to resilience, and also that they don't create more disasters through the projects that they build. Also, Arise US has a major emphasis on the insurance industry, and finally on infrastructure, supporting resilient infrastructure development. Next and last slide here. So we welcome you to join us at Arise US, and there are a few ways to do that. One is that we have an active LinkedIn group. The link is here, and I'll put it in the chat in a moment. And another is to go to the Arise platform globally, which I'll also share in a link. But in the United States, we have dozens of private sector folk that meet on a monthly basis to talk about some of the really major challenges and solutions ahead. And we are so grateful that we also have support from many leaders in other countries, including today, Elisa Trujillo in Mexico, who leads the Mexico Arise and is actually well ahead of a lot of what the United States is doing in that group. We'll share a little bit more about that with us in a moment. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it back to Rachel and really sit back now and listen and learn from this extraordinary set of colleagues that will be helping us better understand how equity and resilience intersect for good.
Thank you so much, Joyce. And thank you for jumping in there, as I think our computer got a little bit ahead of our slide deck. So that was perfect. And so let me just say what I wanted to say before, which is that we are so grateful to Joyce Coffey and Climate Resilience Consulting for co-creating this fantastic lineup of speakers under the auspices of Joyce's role within Arise US, which you just heard about. And just so grateful for your leadership, both in co-creating this webinar and in so much of our collaboration across the ASAP and adaptation space. So we're so thrilled to have this wonderful group of leaders with us from across the globe to speak at the intersection of climate resilience and disaster risk reduction. And we'll be covering how cross-sector collaboration is building equity before climate-induced disasters strike, and how we can move beyond collaboration to enter deep convergent relationships with disaster-affected communities. So first we'll be hearing from Camila Tapias and Antoine Richards, who will share insights from their partnership to build the first equitable decision intelligence tool for emergency management. And then we'll hear from Shefali Lakina and Lau Jamero, who will share entry points and methodological insights for translating research into just and equitable community-centered outcomes. And finally, we're so thrilled to host this panel, again, in partnership with Arise US, and to be able to expand that perspective and be joined in conversation with Elisa Trujillo from Arise Mexico. And without further ado, I want to invite up Camila and Antoine. And Antoine Richards serves as the Chief of Staff for the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management. His experience includes over a decade of work in the healthcare and emergency management sectors, including public health, community outreach, public affairs, diversity, equity, inclusion, and research. He serves on the board of directors for the Alliance for National and Community Resilience, co-leads the Diversity, Equity, and Racial Inclusion Initiative for the Association of Healthcare Emergency Preparedness Professionals. He's a native of Atlanta, and he strives to leverage his knowledge, skills, and abilities to improve outcomes of vulnerable populations through servant leadership. Camila Tapias is a community leader focused on leveraging public-private partnerships, building national and international strategies to increase local capacity for disaster risk reduction, and prioritizing data and science to achieve more equitable outcomes in disaster preparedness. At Spin Global, she leads the business and industry practice area and serves as the International Risk Reduction Program Area Coordinator. Camila conducts assessments of community resilience, supports development of emergency management plans and continuity of operation plans, develops training and exercises in both English and Spanish, and conducts targeted outreach. She serves as the communications director for Arise US Board, the Private Sector Alliance for Disaster Resilient Societies, and she's originally from Bogota, Colombia. Welcome, Antoine and Camila.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Rachel. And hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. I know we have people from in different time zones right now, so thank you for taking the time. And it is an honor to have the opportunity to participate in this panel today. And for this session in particular, we will be talking about cultivating equity through collaboration. In particular, our focus will be on our current partnership between Spain Global, the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management, IDM, Forecast, and the International Association for Emergency Managers to develop an equitable DEI tool using artificial intelligence. Next slide. So thank you, Rachel, for that introduction. So briefly, again, my name is Camila Tapias. Like I said, I'm with Spain Global. I'm a global disaster resilience specialist, and I lead our business and industry practice area and also our efforts around our international practice. And I'm originally from Bogota, Colombia, and I'm a former D1 basketball team captain as well. And so about Spain Global, we'll go to the next slide. Spain Global, we are a public benefit company. We're based in Maryland, also out of Washington, D.C. And our mission is to disrupt disasters from neighborhoods to nations. And how are we disrupting disasters? We provide customized solutions that are focused on disaster resilience, risk reduction, and emergency and crisis management for private industry, governments, and communities. And also an Arise US board member. I'm the communications director, so definitely glad to be here. Next slide. All right, so for today, I'm going to talk about the overview for this initiative to develop an equitable DEI tool. And this initiative started almost 2 years ago, and our goal was to create and build a global community of practice. After we started talking with different experts in the field, we started talking and we realized that there are a lot of historical biases in AI and other technology tools. And I'm sure a lot of you may be aware of this. A lot of cases, as we see right now too, with bias in policing and human resources. So we really started talking about how can we remove biases as much as possible in this process. And this highlighted the need for an equitable DEI tool. And finally, the goal is to, during this process, to prevent further harm in underserved communities. So we're creating a tool that involves all communities. And for DEI and emergency management, if we go to the next slide, in emergency management, and the focus for this initiative is to have equity at the forefront of everything that we do, and equity has to be intentional. We're having a whole community approach, and over this 2 years, we've conducted different webinars and workshops, and right now we're hosting weekly lunch and learns, or also we call them motto ideation calls, where we meet for 30 minutes every Thursday, include different people from the community who want to contribute their expertise to future model development for this framework, for this tool, and just have a conversation. And we're developing a tool that aims to reduce as many blind spots as possible. So it's key to highlight here that, you know, as emergency managers and adaptation professionals in our field, that we need to acknowledge some of those existing inequities in our field that we see and that have been there historically. And some of these events that we've had, and also the support from our partners, and different community engagements events, we're bringing different experts in emergency management, disability experts, public health, economic development, data analytics, GIS, and many more. And, you know, starting from awareness is a good start, but action is key. We can't continue to just talk about it. It's important to be equitable and have diversity. But for us, in particular, for this partnership have been crucial in this process, and also community buy-in as well. And this is truly an example of partnerships and actions, which Antoine will continue to discuss further in this presentation. So we go to the next slide, please. And here, really, as proofs of concepts, we are conducting pilots across the country and internationally as well to understand how to improve these frameworks and this AI and decision intelligence tool. Currently, we're having a pilot in New Hanover County, North Carolina, and I will be going over some of the forecast platform and provide a brief overview of the workflow we're using, as well as a few examples of how the platform looks like based on 2 flood scenarios. Next slide. So here, this is how we start. This is the snapshot of the platform, starting from some of the building workflows. And there's an example based on incident response. And this is the flow that needs to be considered at this stage. For example, you see on the right side, starting from sheltering to debris management to incident management. And then next slide. And then we go here to some of the models or frameworks. In this case, I'm showing examples of FEMA community lifelines. And we're creating a decision-making framework professionals and planners need to be in line with FEMA doctrine, and every case will be different, especially we're talking about an international pilot, but here, as you see, we have, you could select different hospitals and schools and understand, for example, where the vulnerable communities are. So these are just examples for community lifelines, but we go to the next slide. Here, this is how we're pulling all the data, and I will show you with the flood scenario. And here we start at the top with GIS data. Then we go into some of those historical events based on the location where we're doing the pilot. And then we have a client survey where the jurisdiction, we meet with them and we talk about their desired outcomes, the challenges, the need, and what they want to accomplish with the specific pilot. Then we build the preparedness situation, and then we build the scenarios. In this case, we have a 10 feet and a 20 feet scenario, flood scenario in New Hanover County. And then we go into some disaster mitigation insights. And then finally, we will have some of those preparedness recommendations and decision intelligence insights based on the scenario and based on the disruption that we created. Next slide. So here I will be going over briefly both how it looks in the platform with the 10 feet and also the 20 feet scenario. So we're going to start, next slide. Thank you. Here, this is a blue sky scenario here in New Hanover County. We have the community lifelines in the middle, and then we have on the right recommendations to basically improve your preparedness score. So here, there's no disruption. You know, things are good. No, you're good in terms of your capacity in your location. And then we go to the 10 feet scenario. So next slide. So here, let's say that we have the first scenario for 10-foot flood, and you see that the scores now went down in the middle for the community lifelines. It dropped to 73% based on your preparedness. And on the right, we have some of those decision intelligence insights to support leaders with their decision-making process, and it's basically to prioritize their decisions and to support their decision-making process as they see based on their community and what they need. And then if we go to the next slide for the 20 feet scenario, here definitely more disruption, and the community lifelines now it drops to 49%, and went from green to red. And here, these are just examples. As you see the recommendations on the right side, we have more depending on potential shelters, different schools that you may need to prioritize for your community if you need to evacuate it based on this flood. And then you have some of these highlights in terms of infrastructure and the shelters that it will help some of the decision makers to prioritize their decisions. And really, this is a decision support tool that, as we know, there are a lot of things that they need to consider. How can we help them prioritize areas where they can make their decisions? And this is just an example of based on the community lifelines, but on the platform, we are able to add specific dashboards on equity, on infrastructure, transportation, and build different scenarios that the jurisdiction, and then we want to scale as well, that will really customize what they need, in this case with what you can see with New Hanover County. But if we go to the next slide, please. Really here with this process that we've been doing, and Antoine will continue to talk a little bit about it, we're really developing these robust partnerships across sectors to effectively leverage the power of technology to support equity practices and also vulnerable populations. And the goal is to reach effective both internal and external operations. After we've had conversations with different experts in the field, and after we've studied different tools out there, we noticed that technology will help expedite some of those solutions and that process to both DEI challenges and planning processes in emergency management, as we've noticed that a lot of the current solutions require a manual service-based approach, which is not scalable and may also lead to subjective findings in the process. And as we see, a lot of organizations, for example, are currently utilizing DEI assessment services to review and also develop their policies and their programs and their practices, but this tool will help with this process to be more equitable and for them to be more informed with their decisions and reduce some of those biases that I talked about in the front end. So I will turn it over now to Antoine, who will continue to talk about the power of collaboration and partnership. So the floor is yours, Antoine.
Excellent. Next slide, please. And thank you, Camila, for really driving home that. And one of the things I think is really important about this is the fact that she mentioned collaboration, right? So I work for the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management. That is a mouthful, so we call it IDEM for short, IDEM, right? And our purpose is really to facilitate change by integrating equity into all aspects of emergency management. We're one of the few or only organizations who are bound by mission.
Thank you so much, ma'am. You too.
Towards diversity, equity, and inclusion in emergency management. That is literally what we do. Those are our goals. So we're working on multiple different ways to get there. And I think that collaboration is one of those ways. When we think about equity, equity is a bit of a broad topic, right? There's not one approach to equity. So in terms of the partnership that Camila really touched on, we can come up with equity assessments, ways to approach equity and things like that. But I have no idea how to build out what she just showed us, right? Far beyond me, but there are people that do, not only nationally, but globally. So that's part of how these partnerships come about, right? And when we start to implement those in neighborhoods or across the world, we start to see a big difference. So I do want to take some time to just focus on the collaborative part of this, right? The importance of collaboration. Next slide, please. So a little bit more about IDEM. IDEM does a lot. We speak a lot for a lot of our underserved communities. We focus on ways that we can really improve equity and emergency management outcomes. From an advocacy perspective, we've done multiple congressional testimonies, webinars, and we've provided a lot of feedback to many of the policies that we're seeing introduced today here in the United States, including the most recent FEMA Equity Act. Also, in alignment with our goals, we work on different programs that we've implemented, such as our equity response teams, which we deploy after disasters to look for equity within communities and underserved populations and ways that we can improve response. Or our hurricane program, which is a pipeline program for young women into emergency management. Or our scholarship programs. We also have fellowship and internship programs. And we have our BUILD program, which is not listed here, but that's us working directly with communities right now in tribal nations in coastal Louisiana and in the Mississippi Delta. So we do a lot of work on the ground and at the policy level. Next slide. So when we think about collaboration at its very essence, right, the bare bones of collaboration, and I like the word bones, I'm gonna tell you why in a second, but at the bare bones of the conversation, right, it's the action of working with someone to produce or create something. What can I, you, and you create together, right? How can we cooperate together? What is the alliance or the partnership that we can create? How can we associate what I'm doing with what you're doing to create something bigger than what we're all doing, right? How can we come together on common knowledge? What is the common thing that we're interested in? And how do we achieve effective collaboration? So going back to that word bone, I told you I like that word. So prior to all of the things that I've done, and thank you, Rachel, for that wonderful introduction, I was an X-ray tech. That was what I did for 7 years. I worked X-ray. I took pictures of people's bones, and I always enjoyed being an X-ray tech because we were the eyes to the hospital. There was nothing that could be done in the hospital without radiology, right? Next slide, please. So to astound upon that, I started to think about this. How can we connect silos? And it brought me back to the collaboration that happens in hospitals where I've spent the majority of my professional life. Physicians, nurses, respiratory therapists, X-ray techs, PAs, nurse practitioners, they all have to work together. So as an X-ray tech, simple, I take a picture of a broken bone. That one picture goes to a radiologist who reads it and tells you how that bone is broken, how to fix it. The orthopedist comes and he does the same thing. He says, all right, now I know how to fix it. While the orthopedist is in the operating room, there's nurses in there, there's anesthesiologists in there, there's X-ray techs in there taking pictures of what's going on. Everybody is working within their one function, but operating together as a team, right? And the end result is a successful surgery, a healthy person, a life that was saved. So those are connecting silos. Far beyond it, you know, radiology, that was my department. I worked in radiology. That's what I did. I wasn't a nurse. I don't do what they do. I wasn't trained for what they do. I definitely wasn't a doctor. I didn't have an MD, so I can't treat you, diagnose you, or any of that. But my role as an X-ray tech was to take that picture. And because of that one picture, we were all able to work together to create something that was bigger than us. a life saved, right? So when we think about that and we put that in terms of emergency management, and we have public administration, engineers, public health, emergency managers, sociology, psychology, urban planning, right on down the list to communication, we are all working within our roles to improve what we want to see, right? In terms of equity, in terms of helping communities, in terms of a better emergency management. But how can we begin to connect those silos? And that was really the value of the partnership that we have when we started to get into conversations with Spin Global, IEM, and Forecast. Next slide, please. So one of the things I really wanted to drive home in this is that we're all experts in our area. We're all experts at what we do, right? We all have an understanding of what it is that we're doing and what it is we're trying to achieve, but we have to begin to connect the silos that we work in. A lot of times you hear terms that we need to break down these silos. We need to get rid of them. We don't. We need to connect them. Because one person's expertise with my expertise and another person's expertise creates something that's a lot bigger. If we break those down, then we have to start all over again. It's going back to ground one, right? So we have to start working on ways that we can connect those things and work together. We have to understand where and why those silos exist. We have to understand our unique roles and expertise on key issues. And then thinking beyond that, we have to then begin to think about how our roles and our expertise can help others with the same goals. What do I mean by that? Camilla wants to serve underserved populations, right? She has tools that can do that. I want to see better outcomes for underserved populations. I have knowledge and tools that can help me achieve that. ASAP, ARISE, everybody is doing things together to achieve a common goal. How can we work together to do that? And then we also have to understand mutual beneficence. And one of the things I like to point out here is that there has to be something for both parties. So a lot of times the work that we're doing, we provide something to our partners provide something to us, right? So there's always mutual beneficence. So when we're thinking about these partnerships, don't just think about what I can get from this, think about how we can be mutually beneficial. So I really love this graphic. It's called 5 Conditions for Collective Impact. Basically, it guides you through how to break those, how to connect those silos, So individually, we all have specialized agendas. We want to work towards that common agenda that we have to begin connecting silos. We want to take our fragmented measurements, so how we measure equity in engineering is going to be different than how we may measure equity in AI. We want to create shared measurements, ways that we can work together to create good metrics, right? We want to take the independent activities that we have and use mutually reinforcing activities. And I like this. What this means is that we want to reinforce what our partners are doing. So I don't want to take what they have. I want to reinforce what they're doing with what I know. Sporadic communication is something that we do. We communicate in our silos amongst our teams, but communication needs to be continuous. If I'm working on something, I need to inform. Transparency, even with the communities we serve, we need to be transparent with the data, with the findings, with how the decisions are made, because ultimately they're the ones that are impacted by that. And then of course, we want to make sure that we come together as a backbone organization, which is really why I like initiatives like ARISE, because they're coming together as a backbone organization. Next slide, please. So a few things I want you to remember as we get through this. The need for collaboration lies within connecting silos. Remember, our goal is not to break those silos down, it's to connect them. We want to start to think collaboratively. We want to connect, right? We want to start to leverage our resources and partnerships to achieve mutual goals and outcomes. We want to think partners and collaborators versus competition. That's not my competition, that is a potential partner. And then we want to remember that the most successful businesses and partnerships usually sustain on collaboration. Nobody's in this alone. Next slide. So collaboration in action, and this is really tying into what Camila was presenting earlier, but we've been able to partner and come together, again, taking this same mindset that I don't understand AI like that. I think there's opportunity there. So how can we explore those opportunities? And through that, we've been able to come up with partnered ways to come together on like equitable AI and decision intelligence. There's been multiple webinars that we've been able to conduct together on this topic, hosted by each of the partners, and then working together for equitable decision intelligence. Ways to integrate AI into emergency management. There have been data assessment tools and equity assessment tools that we've been able to say, we need assistance on. How can we standardize this? Can we make an app for that? Is there something that people can use on their phone to really look at equity? And then they say, yeah, we can work on that for you, right? That's something that's far beyond us, but it's going to have such an impact in the future, right? So remember that we take these partnerships and we use it to influence policy, practice, and research. And it creates opportunities for others to come in and join that partnership and continue connecting those silos. Next slide. So I will turn it back to Camila for some closing remarks, but these are definitely some resources, and I'll let her talk about the resources on her end, and I'll follow up with item number 5.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Antoine. That was great. And here, based on this initiative, like I can mention, we're really trying to create a global community of practice. And here, if you have any more questions and you want to get involved and learn more, for the sake of time, of course, we can go into a lot of detail and a lot of the process and things that we've done. So email us at equity@spinglobal.org to join our weekly lunch and learns. And also, if you have any questions, access our open source content for our first model release, GitHub. It's all open source data, forecast AI. And also sign up for an equitable decision intelligence pilot. If you know of someone from a specific jurisdiction, or if your organization may be interested to sign up for a pilot, please do so as well. And we also have a LinkedIn group. It's called Equitable Decision Intelligence for Emergency Management. Please join that as well. Over to you, Antoine.
Excellent, thank you. And as always, IDEM offers tons of resources on our website. So we have toolkits, we have guidebooks, we have different resources, checklists on a lot of different things, from inclusive emergency management to engaging immigrant and refugee populations, to working with tribal nations, to expanding equity and mitigation, to partnerships and resources that we've developed with FEMA, American Flood Coalition. So there's a lot of different resources that we offer, and I encourage you to just check the link and check them out, and hopefully they'll be helpful for you in your future endeavors. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Camila and Antoine. That was incredible. I have to admit, some of the technology stuff went way over my head. Anytime someone has GitHub, I'm like, okay, I know who to send this to. It's not me, but I have some people. But I just love the way that you, first of all, modeled collaboration in your presentation, and then just how we were able to really get in depth on, what does it mean to have equitable decision intelligence, and who are all the different types of folks that have to be contributing to that. Just a really excellent way to kick us off. Thank you so much. And now I am so pleased to introduce Shafali and Lau for our next paired presentation. So Shafali Lakina has over 18 years of international experience and thought leadership on disaster policy, practice, and research. She has contributed to conceptualizing, implementing, facilitating, and monitoring a range of policies, programs, and initiatives for strengthening disaster resilience across South Asia, the Middle East, North Africa, Southeast Europe, Australia, and the US. She has led innovations in disaster resilience policy and programs for international humanitarian and development agencies, regional intergovernmental organizations, national authorities, local councils, and civil society organizations. As co-founder of Wonder Labs, Shafali is currently engaged in co-developing social, ecological, and technological innovations with communities on the front lines of extreme climate impacts, including wildfires. Lau Jamero leads the Resilience Collaboratory of the Manila Observatory, where she works closely with local governments and civil society organizations across the Philippines to support their climate and disaster risk management and adaptation planning efforts. At the regional and international level, she also volunteers her time at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Working Group 1, Future Earth Coasts, and Southeast Asia Science Advisory Network. Lau is passionate about engaging vulnerable communities in understanding climate risks and designing possible solutions, building on existing adaptive capacities, and creating hope for the future through collaborative climate action. She's launching her own startup, EarthEd PH, focused on promoting climate education through knowledge exchange at the community level. And her PhD research focused on climate change adaptation in small island communities. Welcome, Shafali and Lau.
Thanks for that great introduction, Rachel. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm going to tell you a bit about my research on disaster and equity issues in Australia, and then reflect on how I'm translating that research to inform my current focus on building equity for wildfire resilience in the Western United States. And I'm really hopeful that this translation will spark some useful ways of thinking about building equity through collaboration before crises. Next slide. So I'm going to make three main points in this very brief talk. First, I'll set the context for my equity work, which I think about as a process of co-learning disaster resilience with people from diverse backgrounds. I'll show how co-learning is really about bringing greater intentionality in how we choose entry points, create partnerships, and converge around equity and justice outcomes. Next, I'll show how to operationalize this process of co-learning through a person-centered approach that emphasizes care, which you can think of as both the sentiment of care, but also as an acronym for practices of collaboration, accountability, responsiveness, and empowerment. And then in closing, I'll talk a bit about why it's important to go beyond piecemeal collaboration that is too often output-focused, and instead move towards system-wide convergence that strives to be outcomes-centered. Next slide. Now, let me introduce you to the site of my research. What you see up on the map is the Illawarra region of New South Wales in Australia. It's a coastal region, about 50 miles south of Sydney. It experiences a range of natural hazards, including bushfires, heat waves, storms, flooding, lightning, sea level rise, and the risk of tsunamis. It really has it all. Now, it so happens that newly arrived people from refugee and migrant backgrounds are frequently caught unaware by these hazards. This is in part because they do not receive basic hazards and safety information from state and local humanitarian resettlement agencies before they arrive in Australia. So they're really not sure what to expect in terms of local hazards. And so the question that state and local institutions and services have grappled with is around how to conduct better outreach and preparedness initiatives with these culturally and linguistically diverse and emerging communities. Now, for my research, I turned that question around to ask, how can local institutions learn from and partner with these emerging communities for the well-being of all of community? And so guided by that framing, we set out to develop a better understanding of how to go about co-learning disaster resilience with people from diverse backgrounds. Next slide. Now, the research got funding from the Australian Research Council and the New South Wales Office of Emergency Management to bring together multiple partners from different sectors and levels of activity, including my university, the University of Wollongong, emergency management agencies, city councils, multicultural agencies, refugee resettlement services, along with many local and international research observers. Next slide. Now, given the range of partners that got involved in this research process, we had to be really intentional about choosing entry points for bringing together multiple partners in a meaningful way. We didn't want to just collaborate over short-term outputs, like creating more information packets to disseminate to emerging communities. That had already been done and not worked. Instead, all partners considered it important to agree on the desired outcomes that can create ways to sustain lasting engagement and responsive partnerships with these emerging communities. Up on the slide, you can see some media coverage about the research project back in 2017 that describes some of these entry points and partnerships, which proved so useful. Next slide. And most of what I will now share with you about the methodology can be found in this co-learning disaster resilience toolkit. The link should be in the resource list being currently shared in the chat, for which thanks to Rachel and her team. Next slide. Now, let me say a bit about how we went about this process of co-learning. In terms of the overall process flow and key actions, I led the research component by facilitating thematic discussions in the form of personal and household interviews, group discussions, listening sessions, and simulation exercises. Next, I compiled resilience narrative maps to represent people's unique lived experiences, their strengths, challenges, and needs. And I'll say a bit more about this soon. And then the final step was for local agencies and services to operationalize the co-learning process through 3 stages, which I summarize as inform, engage, and partner. Now let's briefly dive into some of these steps. Next slide. What you see up here on the slide is a person-centered tool I developed to understand people's unique lived experiences, strengths, challenges, and needs. And these aspects are presented as 4 quadrants along the 2 continuums of mobility and resilience. I developed these maps for each of the research participants, and you can download some of them from the toolkit online. This particular one maps the resilience journey of a person from Syria to Australia. Next slide. And what this tool delivered was a robust intersectional understanding of how people experience unfamiliar landscapes and practice safety in an uncertain climate. And this intersectional analysis was foundational to developing more responsive and appropriate outreach and partnerships based on people's gender, age, cultural beliefs, and personal histories. Now, from a systems perspective, these narratives revealed both overlaps and gaps in outreach work. The maps helped clearly show how emergency management agencies and local services were in fact working in silos. So what the project tried to do over the course of that year was to learn from community experiences and regularly translate findings for institutional stakeholders. We had frequent and open conversations where we would bring institutional and community representatives together. And interestingly, in most cases, this happened to be the first time that people from refugee backgrounds sat around the same table as local officials and shared their experiences. And this approach led to the development of the New South Wales State Emergency Services' first ever multicultural liaison unit, comprising liaison officers from diverse refugee backgrounds. Formed in December 2017, this unit now serves as a nationwide model for not just informing newly arrived people, but also for systematically engaging and partnering with and linguistically diverse populations. Next slide. And up on this slide, you can read testimonials from people who were resettled in the region and have been trained as part of the multicultural liaison unit in recent years. And this outcome really demonstrates how local institutions and services can reach beyond their historical silos and top-down methods to come together in novel ways for more just and equitable disaster resilience outcomes. Next slide. And in 2018, our research collaboration received a highly commended Resilient Australia Award from the New South Wales Office of Emergency Management. We're all very proud of this, of course, but this is not to say that there haven't been any challenges since. We all know that equity work is a moving goalpost. It's never truly done. So we have to keep at it. And I'm happy to talk about some of these remaining challenges during our Q&A. Next slide. I want to now briefly touch upon how we are translating this research and these insights and the co-learning methodology into our current work at Wonder Labs. We are primarily doing this by co-learning with students who live and work and oftentimes belong to communities on the front line of wildfire impacts across the Western United States. We launched the Reimagining 2025 Living with Fire Design Challenge last year. And through this program, we invite student-led teams to facilitate inclusive visioning exercises with diverse communities. So partners across sectors and scales of activity can truly co-learn how to live in a fiery future. And up on this slide, you can see some of the wonderful outcomes from our first cohort last year that worked with diverse communities in California and Colorado. And we are currently accepting proposals for our 2022 cohort. So if you're interested or know someone who might be interested, please get in touch. Next slide. In conclusion, I want to leave you with 3 reflections that really distill everything I've tried to say in this brief talk. My first reflection is that to build equity before crises, it will be important to move from a top-down emergency management communication model towards a co-learning disaster resilience approach that engages communities with care. The second reflection is that it is possible to move from a token inclusion and representation of diversity towards co-creating equity and justice outcomes with historically and socially marginalized communities. And finally, I encourage you all to bring greater intentionality in how you move from output-centered piecemeal collaborations towards outcomes-focused convergence approaches that explicitly work towards equity and justice outcomes. I hope the presentation sparks some ideas for how to put communities and an ethic of care at the center of our work. And I really look forward to diving deeper during our Q&A, and now look forward to learning from Lau's work in the Philippines. Over to you, Lau.
Thank you so much, Shefali, for sharing with us your experiences in Illawarra and also your work at Wonder Labs. So to add to the discussion, I'd like to turn our attention to the Philippines, where I hope to share with you how I think scientists and practitioners can work closely with communities, especially in terms of implementing adaptation strategies and ultimately building resilience. So next slide, please. Yeah, today I'd like to talk about my home island. So I'm currently based here in Bohol, Philippines. Next slide, please. So Bohol is essentially a proper tropical island paradise with white sand beaches and the usual. But I think what makes the island very unique is that we have a double barrier reef on the northern side of our island. So as you know, a double barrier reef is actually a very rare geological formation. And today I'd like to talk about 4 small island communities that are located in the southern tip. So next slide, please. Okay, so this is just an aerial shot of one of the 4 islands that I'll be talking about today. Next slide, please. All right, so some of the key things that I'd like you to know about these islands is that number 1, they are very small and low-lying, as you can see from the photo. So the 4 islands, and actually all of the islands in the double barrier reef, have maximum elevations of just about 2 meters, which is very similar to many other small island developing states. And at the same time, these islands are impoverished. So they are your typical subsistent fishing villages. So next slide, please. Okay. All right, so what happened in these islands? So these islands actually are now experiencing tidal flooding, which is one of the earliest earliest impacts of sea level rise. So next slide, please. All right, so in 2013, we experienced an earthquake here in Bohol, which induced land subsidence in these islands. And as a result, the island started to experience tidal flooding even during normal high tides. So I'm not sure if you can remember, but we had a super moon last week. So there was also a very high tide in those islands last week. So looking at the drivers of tidal flooding, of course, we have local drivers, which is the earthquake in 2013. But then throughout the years, the flooding actually has grown worse, and we have to take into account global drivers such as accelerated sea level rise. And in these areas, the rate of sea level rise is actually 3 to 4 times higher than the global average. Next slide, please. All right, so as you can imagine, the islands are very much impacted by tidal flooding. As you see from the photos, the schools are flooded. The waste are essentially all going into the water, and the roads are flooded as well. So it's hampering their mobility. But what I also want you to understand is that even though the islands are severely affected by tidal flooding, life actually still continues in these islands. So next slide, please. All right, so I think what we are all most interested in is, what are the islanders doing about it? And when it comes to adaptation in small islands, from what I've noticed, so I'm a scientist, actually I'm with IPCC and WCRP. What I noticed is that scientists and actually practitioners alike who have never been to these islands tend to underestimate the sense of place, the sense of attachment, the sense of identity that these communities derived from their islands. And so with that, there's a tendency for the mass migration theory to basically dominate the conversation, with a lot of external actors condemning the islands as sinking or disappearing. I think it appears a lot in the news these days. But here I'm showing a photo of our brothers from the Pacific, where they are basically protesting and trying to highlight that, in fact, they are not drowning and they are fighting. Next slide, please. All right, so I'm happy to report that even for a very impoverished fishing village, they are actually able to pursue different types of adaptation strategies, which I classified into two categories, basically. So one is the retreat strategy, where they could permanently relocate away from the small islands and into the mainland, or they could temporarily evacuate, especially during typhoons. And then in situ strategies, they could pursue community-based adaptation, ecosystem-based adaptation, and coastal engineering. So next slide, please. All right, so similar to external actors, even the local government that was based on the mainland, their knee-jerk reaction was really to permanently relocate the people away from the islands. But over the years, thankfully, they have changed their attitude towards relocation as well, seeing that the islanders are really reluctant to move from the islands to the mainland because their livelihood is based on fishing. So with that, the municipal government, for example, is now more open to a hybrid type of relocation, wherein the island communities stay on the mainland, but then they are able to retain their houses, especially fishermen, so that they can have a place to stay whenever they go out fishing. And at the same time, the local government previously was very, adamant about relocating people, but now they are working more closely with the people and are more willing to invest in situ strategies. So next slide, please. All right, so I would say that the most effective and successful adaptation strategy that they have done on the islands is to change their evacuation behavior. So previously, before the earthquake and before the onset of tidal flooding, they only evacuated during strong typhoons. But now, even if it's a weak weather system, just a storm or a tropical depression, as long as it coincides with the peak tide, then they just relocate either to the big houses on the island or to the mainland. Next slide, please. I'd also like to highlight ecosystem-based adaptation. Unfortunately, its effect has been limited in the island, mainly because, for example, the coral reefs are being mined and the marine protected area are becoming smaller and smaller. So essentially, what's happening is that the community doesn't have really an appreciation of reefs as helping them protect them from the waves. And instead, what they are seeing is that the mangroves, which are above water, and they can literally see the mangroves that are dissipating waves. And so with that, there's a lot of awareness raising and education that's needed on the island to make this strategy more effective. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and of course, there's a little bit of coastal engineering on the islands too. Actually, the residents really do prefer to have seawalls because it makes them feel more secure. But then at the same time, the seawalls are not designed very well. So basically, they are vertical. So with that, they tend to exacerbate coastal erosion instead. So next slide, please. All right, so this is a figure that I borrowed from IPCC Working Group 2, the latest report. And this shows the continuum of adaptation and maladaptation. And I hope here that you can appreciate how it's a very tall order to achieve successful adaptation. You have to benefit people, it has to be good for the environment, you have to pursue sustainable development for everyone, the strategy itself needs to be transformative, and it also has to have mitigation benefits, co-benefits. So that's a very tall order. And as I hope you appreciated from my previous slides, there's a very real risk of maladaptation in these islands, mainly because most of the strategies are in a way reactive. The tidal flooding happened first before they are able to do all of these adaptation strategies. And so it tends to be hyper-focused on reducing vulnerability without necessarily being good for the environment as well, such as coral mining. And so I think this is also a real opportunity for researchers and scientists and practitioners to collaborate with the community. We are there to support their existing adaptive capacity and to recognize that they are ticking some of the boxes, but also to support them and to complement their efforts and really to reduce the risk of maladaptation. So I think that's one of the main key message that I do want to send out to you. All right, so just to give you a bit of examples, so myself, I'm raising awareness about the coral reefs as ecosystem-based adaptation. Some NGOs are also in these islands. They are trying to alleviate poverty, so targeting equity outcomes by, for example, introducing alternative livelihoods that actually also reduce pressure on the environment, especially from overfishing. And there's also different environmental organizations that are trying to introduce seaweed farming on these islands because seaweeds are amazing in sequestering greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So these are just some examples of how we can collaborate with the community and actually letting the community take the lead in terms of defining their own adaptation approach. So with that, I'd like to turn over to Rachel. Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you so much, Shefali and Lau. That was so wonderful. And I just love the complementarity of these two presentations, that we got to explore two different communities in a totally different part of the globe and really get a glimpse into what does adaptation actually look like on the ground? And most importantly, how can we be building from communities' existing adaptive capacity and supporting that? I think that is such a strong and critical message. So I am so pleased now to invite up Elisa Trujillo. Elisa is a Mexican national and an architect with a specialty in sustainable architectural design. She specializes in urban transformation, disaster resilience, and climate change, as well as their relationship with poverty eradication. She currently co-leads the Resilience Working Group for the 2030 Agenda at UNGC Mexico and is the National Director for Arise Mexico. She's served with international organizations in a variety of countries, and she's also participated in many social projects in Mexico with more than 250 multi-sector allies. So just a wonderful person to be coming and sharing insights on our theme of collaboration and partnership. And I'm going to turn it over to Elisa to share a little bit about Arise Mexico, as well as her insights on all of the wonderful presentations that we just heard. And we'll have the opportunity to be in conversation with her for a few minutes here. And I want to encourage folks to add questions in Slido for all of our presenters, because we'll be opening it up to an open Q&A with all of our panelists once we have a chance to hear from Elisa. I think you're still on mute, Elisa.
Yes, I am. Many thanks, Rachel, for this introduction, and many thanks to my colleagues before. Those were excellent presentations, and I'm very happy to share a little bit of what we're doing in Arise Mexico. And I'm sure that it will make sense to share some of, or take out some of their points, the key points that they have shown before me. So first of all, I would like to guide you through how was the process for us to launch Arise in Mexico, and how the private sector is identifying the relationship between equity, sustainable development, and different disasters. As companies, we have been working for many years before in different topics and different challenges that we have as humanity, such as poverty. In Mexico, we have almost 50% or a little bit more of 50% from our population under the poverty line. We know that still climate change is our first and main challenge for as humans, and we live in one of the most inequity regions. According to the Equality World Report, Mexico, 10% of the Mexicans have more than 79% of the resources in our country. And of course, we have different challenges now, very evident through COVID, in not only at physical level, but also in mental health. Education, we know that after disasters occurred, if our kids do not go back to school after 4 months, according to different studies, probably they won't come back. So we have a huge challenge over there. And of course, gender violence. In Mexico, we have more than 11 women murdered per day. So those are different statistics and different challenges that we have, not only as a private sector, but as a society. And we were just checking why, even when we're working very hard, sometimes we're not moving the needle as much as we can. So through a process of research, we have come up with a RISE initiative, and we have identified that companies cannot be successful in weak environments. Unfortunately, resilience is, or fortunately, resilience is a key for us to move forward. And we have come with these global agendas that we have already been working with the Paris Agreement, with UNICEF for Kids, with gender subjects, and many others through the SDGs. But we came up with the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, and we identified that through resilience, we can connect this competitiveness to increase the competitiveness from our companies, and also produce the well-being from our society. There's a fundamental interdependency between business and society, and we identify that not only we have a responsibility as part of our society, but also a business opportunity to be more competitive and more sustainable in the long term, passing from business as usual towards more sustainable models. So I will not go further in detail. I think Joyce made an excellent introduction to our RISE. It's a voluntary network from the private sector. We are at global level in more than 40 countries, and we're working alongside with the United Nations Disaster for Risk Reduction Office. And our main goal is to construct disaster resilient societies. So in Mexico, we launched this initiative. Globally was launched in 2015. In Mexico, we launched it in 2018. And nowadays, we're working with more than 200 institutions, and very closely with a platform that is called Unidos por Ellos, which means together for them. And as Camila and Antoine were saying, it's very important for us to connect the silos, but also to identify our strengths and our priorities, where we want to focus. So we have 4 main areas where we focus. We focus to reinforce the SMEs, to make sure that each peso that we're investing in Mexico is going to the sustainable development of our country and our communities, not to the reconstruction. We identify insurance also as a main area, and there we develop different tools, guidance, and to transfer the residual risk from our most vulnerable communities And last but not least, the resilience infrastructure. And we focus mainly on critical infrastructure such as education infrastructure, medical facilities, and basic services. So during the first years, we have focused much more in communication and communicate and increase the awareness for disaster risk reduction and why is it important for business, not only to see it as a philanthropy cause, but also as a strategy for their business models and to integrate it in their operations to make sure that they put all the effort and do not see it as an isolated cause. And recently we have moved from the words to the action. So we're very happy. We're going to launch this year 4 different working groups that respond to our main action areas, led by different institutions that are very committed and that are bringing other companies to work together to achieve our goals in an effective manner. And it's very important for me to mention that as Arise, we do not believe, in Mexico we say, no nos inventamos el hilo negro. That means that we're not actually bringing anything new, but we're merely articulators of different efforts that have been made very good by other companies. So we want to make sure that we do not duplicate. Duplication makes that our efforts are very dispersed or scattered. So what we want to do is to make sure that we're working together with all these great institutions that are doing a great job also within their business, but also with their communities. This is just like some of our main partners that are working in these working groups by now. They're very active. They're developing different plans, guidelines, strategies, tools, and we also have 2 different projects in communities. And nowadays we're, as you might know, we're struggling with water at the north part of Mexico. So we're also coming up with a project with some partners in regards to water in Mexico for scarcity, for stress, and in the south part of our country for floodings. And I would like to, these are my last slides, and I would like to focus in one project that is very exciting for us. We know that disaster risk reduction is not only prevention and preparation as we see it in Arise. We know that it's transversal and that we can have different disaster risk management, such as prospective, corrective, and reactive. Hence, we partner with other networks in Mexico from the private sector, such as CBI, the Connecting Business Initiative, represented in Mexico through SENACED, and such the UN Global Compact in Mexico. So basically what we're doing is we are creating a model for articulation that brings a top-down approach and also a bottom-up for operation and strategy. And Arise is working mainly in prevention and mitigation, also a little bit in preparation. So everything before the disaster hits. SENACED has a really good model that articulates the private sector so we can respond and reinforce the government actions in less than 2 weeks within the affected communities. And we both work for the recovery of them. We are working mainly in the strategy, so that's the first level that you see, but we are working with different institutions that are already on field. So they are our arms and legs within the communities to reach them and to make sure that we channelize all the efforts from the private sector towards the most vulnerable communities. And I will stop here, Rachel, to start our conversation. And I hope that we can also keep on building community together through Arise and through the private sector and the different sectors that are working with us today.
Elisa, thank you so much. I love hearing about both the specific conditions that you're working within throughout the whole country in Mexico, as well as so much that's transferable across contexts. We have folks on from all over the globe on this webinar today, and I think that there's really something that can resonate with each and every one of us, even with the specific context that you shared. And I want to dig into that a little bit, because we heard from all of our presenters about the possibility for collaboration and partnership across different contexts. You know, Antoine brought this really interesting perspective of not breaking down silos, but rather connecting them. And I'm sticking with that image because I think it really resonates with what other folks shared as well, that we all bring a unique perspective. And I'd love for you to kick us off in our discussion, Elisa, by sharing a little bit about how do you balance in your work the need to keep unique conditions central and to guide the work, especially that happens in each individual community, with the opportunity to partner and collaborate across so many different contexts that bring perspectives in from the outside. And what does that look like for you?
Thanks, Rachel. I think Camila and Antoine's presentation was great, and actually it was very enlightful for me to see that these ideas are permeating in different contexts. I believe that two ideas that I recovered from them is priority and also the power of collaboration that Antoine was mentioning. And I believe that to integrate this into your work, it has to be part of your work from the beginning. So I think that for us, for instance, in the private sector, we identify very clear which is our role during this collaboration. And through collaboration, we also can access to different knowledge that it might not be the same context, but those are very good lessons that we can integrate into our actions. So I think that the example that Anton was mentioning with this medical example was great, because for me, those are the key points that we have to integrate into our work and how we can move forward, not only into the words and the strategies and the plans that we have in our desk, but also towards the actions within the communities.
Thank you so much. I want to open it up to the rest of the panel to respond to that question as well. So feel free, any of our speakers, to chime in, and I'll just send a reminder for folks, if you have specific questions, to please post them in Slido. We have some questions that came in from Camila that she's answered, and then we're happy to lift up additional questions as well from the audience. And Shefali, I see you unmuting. Would you like to jump in?
Yep. I think that's a great question, and I love Elisa's reflections. I think it's important to think about how we come together, why we come together, and what we do together. That's really the context for how I think about co-learning. And I think of myself as a bridge, not so much the doer on the ground, but the bridge that connects across levels of activity. And that's why I really like the convergence approach and that framework. It is a theoretical framework, but it's so applied, as I've demonstrated from my own work. And I think the key point about convergence is that it does go beyond that kind of piecemeal collaboration over specific outputs. What are we co-producing? What are we co-creating together? As opposed to having this kind of longer, deeper conversation around co-learning, right? How are we learning with for much more kind of longer term sustained engagement and partnerships. And I think it's what convergence offers is that it helps us connect, as Antoine was saying, across not just sectors, but scales or levels of activity. Hyper-local projects cannot, in my opinion and experience, cannot deliver the kinds of equity and justice outcomes we need if they aren't thinking about and connecting with the regional, statewide, national, and international scales. That is structural change, right? When you're able to connect those. And that to me is really the advantage of thinking through the convergence lens. And And yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Wonderful. And I want to invite Camila or Antoine or Lau to jump in on this question if you'd like as well.
Yeah, I could jump in. I think it's just important to when it comes to it, to really just be intentional about it, you know, think through it, plan it. How do I want to put this? I know things never really go as planned, so planning is probably the better term, right? Don't make a plan about it and say I'm going to do that. Just incorporate it into your everyday planning, right? So you make a plan and you say I want to engage better, I want to do better. And there's going to be a million reasons why you can't, or things may come up that are a hindrance or a barrier to it. So just incorporate it into your daily planning, right? Or into your monthly planning or your strategic priorities or whatever you want to call it. Incorporate it into that. And that allows you to constantly work towards what it is you're trying to achieve there, to seek beyond, you know, what you have and say, there are resources and there are opportunities and I'm going to be intentional about it. Think about who those partnerships can be, whether it's the community, which communities, why those communities, how can I integrate with those communities, right? Do I understand those communities culturally, socially, economically? Do I understand the root causes of vulnerability? Or same thing with other organizations you want to work with. What is their mission? What is their vision? How does that align with my mission and my vision? Might not be this month, but maybe 6 months down the line, I know there's this initiative I'm thinking on, I'm planning on, you know, partnering with them or maybe just reaching out. And instead of saying, oh, I plan to do it in 6 months, send them a quick email today. Operate in real time. Hey, you know, there are a few thoughts in my mind, some things that I think, you know, we're interested in doing, maybe not today, but a few months down the line, it may be good to talk about it, something. And then once you establish that foundation, just maintain it. You know, constant communication is, I think I put it in the presentation, but continuous communication is important. It's really easy to establish relationships and everybody says, oh, this is great. I met this person. They'll be a great asset. And then we never hear from them again or follow up afterwards, right? So even if it's a month down the line, you're sitting down having coffee, you say, I wonder how Lau's doing. Let me just, Lau, I don't want anything. I'm just checking in, really enjoyed the presentation again. Maybe we can set up a virtual coffee or something, right? Sometimes it's really that simple and just saying, hey, this is in my planning to maintain this relationship, or, you know, there are things down the line I think we can do. So, you know, just being forward thinking, being innovative, and that's kind of my input there.
That's wonderful. And I love that we have everything from an academic paper from Shefali describing convergence down to a step-by-step plan for anyone to follow on relationship building from Antoine. Like, we have the whole spectrum of strategies for this, and it's awesome. Because we are coming up on our time together here, which is really sad because I feel like I could go on all day with all of you. This has been so wonderful. I want to ask one last question for you all to leave us with some wisdom and advice. So we've heard about the need to co-create long-term equitable outcomes, and we've heard some strategies for doing that. But I would love for you each to leave us with, what's an outcome that you're working towards, and how can we support you? And Camila, can I call on you to start us off here?
Sure. Yeah, and I think I briefly mentioned this in when I was talking. I think time and time again, we continue to see how, and even with these conversations were important, but just talking about, you know, equity and the importance, but not really doing much about it. And I think that is long overdue to really kind of walk that equity talk. And I think this is something that we all sometimes feel that we have this big goals and ambitions. And I know Briley talked about our initiative, but even I would challenge you for like outcomes that you're talking about, Rachel, with that question, even in our individual roles, in your jobs, always just questioning, you know, how can I think about this differently that maybe I didn't think about in terms of biases that sometimes are unintentional and that I could do in my job. And that's already taking a step in the right direction into just being more equitable on your personal level as a professional. And that, you know, will help with just building some of those partnerships, as Antoine mentioned, and just being more intentional in the process. And I think one more thing that I will mention is just to always have in mind that as we build these partnerships, to always think about our communities that we're trying to serve, and always plan with the communities and not for them, because sometimes we may forget about that and we think that we know what they need. But in this process, it's always important to have different touching points to connect with them and understand, is this what we're thinking? How this is what you need? Or is this completely off? What are those blind spots? And I think Lau mentioned that as well with what she explained. So I think those are a few things that I would highlight.
That's great. Thank you so much, Camila. And I really especially appreciate how you've brought this concept of bias to our conversation here with a really tangible example of technology. But of course, that shows up in so many places, and we can always hold one another accountable to recognize and work to eliminate our biases. And how about Lau? Do you feel ready to share?
Yes, thank you so much. So I think you can observe from my presentation that I really do love working with the community. And when I say you collaborate with the community is really front and center, and everything really starts from the community. But at the same time, as Shefali mentioned, you cannot be hyper local if you really want to create transformative change. So one thing that I am working towards currently is the campaign for loss and damage funding facility at the UNFCCC level. So personally, my experience was that we were hit by a super typhoon back in December, and I witnessed firsthand the loss and damage that we suffered from that experience. And now I'm organizing the first loss and damage workshop here in Southeast Asia, where we try to come up with our contextualized understanding of loss and damage. And ultimately, we want to use that for launching a campaign at the UNFCCC to really get and try to establish that funding facility for the different communities that are already suffering from the negative impacts of climate change. So it's a long road ahead for us. But for me, one of my favorite things to do is to try and build empathy basically with the different people that we meet, especially those that are very far removed from the communities. So one of the tools that I really rely on are our films, documentaries, virtual reality films, and I share the link through Beth. So that's Raising the King Tide. And we've attracted like thousands of people from COP to just watch those films and really try to understand what this whole conversation is about. So in terms of what support we need, I think especially in the case of loss and damage, the policy is going first, is going ahead before the science. So last week, I was just calling on the scientific community to provide support and give us a better understanding of loss and damage and how to measure that. But really, the policy is also following the experience of small island developing states, low developing countries are really leading the charge in that campaign for loss and damage, because that is what we really experience as our reality today. So that's why I feel like it's really important that we put the community front and center, but at the same time give them a voice in these international forums.
Thank you so much, Lau, for bringing that to our conversation. Really critically important. And I love that in our conversations in preparation for today, you've really helped me refine my thinking about what constitutes holistic climate action, that it's not just mitigation and adaptation, but it's mitigation and adaptation and loss and damage. So thank you so much for bringing that to us. I want to recognize that we have run up against our time. We are certainly going to keep moving through our panelists so we can hear all of their insightful closing thoughts. Recognize that some folks may need to leave us, but I really encourage anyone who's able to stay on with us, and we'll keep moving through to the end of our program. But for anyone who does need to leave, thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to connecting with you soon. Elisa, do you feel ready to share on your final words of wisdom for us?
Sure, thank you, Rachel. Well, as I mentioned before, our main objective is to build disaster resilient societies. We know that's very broad, and we know that we have too much to do, though talking, as Camila mentioned, about priorities and focus, we are focusing in reducing the vulnerabilities to prevent disasters and to increase the capacity, the resilience capacity from our communities through different workshops, through different guidelines. And also we're focusing to have a long-term outcome, to define a path, define a role for the private sector. So what I would like to mention right now is 3 things. We are building a self-diagnosed tool for our companies so we can identify which is the level in which we are and how can we contribute better. We have developed a protocol with 10 essentials. So each company that wants to build a better future for their communities and to be very active in the building of resilient communities, know how to reinforce their business and how to contribute to this resilience in a collective way, because we identify that we cannot do it alone. And last but not least, we are also developing a tool with the UPS Foundation that it's called Resilience in a Box. So if you already know where you are and you know where you want to head, you have this roadmap with different tools and different information and different information and access to different ways to reach your goal faster, in a collaborative way, and with greater impact to your communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elisa. And how about Antoine?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I think one of the things that we're really working on at IDEM, because we operate in emergency management and with disasters, is that the system and the things that have been going on over time, they continue. We're still seeing disparities. We're still seeing underserved, vulnerable, and marginalized populations. And one of the things we're really pushing right now is the fact that we have to do disasters differently, right? So I think if we're looking for an outcome, it would be to change the way that we have historically handled disasters and start to think of new, innovative ways to do that. And you'll see a lot of that through our community engagement work and what we're really working on the policy side. So I think that's one outcome we're really looking at. And I think the last thing that I could possibly leave this particular webinar with, since we're talking about collaboration, is to really focus on collaboration in action. So, make it an actionable thing, that it is a possible thing. We can definitely collaborate, and that, it is a possibility as long as you want it to be. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Antoine. And certainly not least, but last on our go around now, Shefali.
Yeah, like I said before, I think equity work is a moving goalpost. It's never really done. So in terms of outcomes, when I think about whether it's the Multicultural Liaison Unit in the Illawarra in New South Wales, or it's the communities that we're supporting through our Living with Fire Design Challenge, through Wonderlab's work in California and Colorado, we make it a point to develop lasting relationships so we can help partners on the ground connect the dots, continually think through challenges, even after the project is over in terms of funding cycle or whatever. Because we're building relationships here, and we really want to be the bridge, the facilitator, the glue, however you want to think of yourself, right? Of a more caring ecosystem of this kind of adaptation workforce, the wildfire resilience, forestry fire workforce. There is so much to be done, and there is so much being done. There's so much great work. And each of us have our roles, but within these contexts of stitching together and connecting and bridging. And in terms of outcomes, I think that's where, we want to continuously keep at it. We want to keep checking in with partners, whether they're on the ground, whether it's affecting change at policy level. It's work that needs constant doing, and we're committed to it. And I'm so grateful to you, Rachel and Joyce, and for organizing this. And I'm now part of the Adaptation Society. So I really look forward to connecting with more people and institutions to further this really important work. So thank you.
Shefali, thank you so much. And, couldn't have a better segue to just our final slides here. Of course, first and foremost, just sending an enormous thank you to each one of our speakers, Antoine, Camila, Shefali, Lau, and Elisa. Another special thank you to Joyce for supporting and co-developing this webinar. And I also want to give a thank you to Beth Gibbons, ASAP's Executive Director, and ASAP's Board of Directors, who developed the co-creation webinar series program and are so much to thank for just creating the space that we've all been able to be in today. And on the theme of lasting relationships, we would love for you to continue to connect with us. You can join a peer learning meeting. You can register for our Principles of Adaptation training, and you can come to our next co-creation webinar series, continuing on our Global Adaptation Action arc. We're going to be talking about multilateral action and the global stocktake. This is just a reminder about the rest of the webinars in the series for this year. And finally, we just really appreciate you and hope that you'll continue to stay involved or get involved in ASAP by joining the network, by donating to support this work, and just connecting with us here at ASAP with our staff, because we'd love to make sure that you have access to the adaptation resources and connections that you need to do your work well. And with that, I want to say thank you one more time to our partners at Arise US and to our wonderful panelists. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. And a special thanks to Lau for staying up until 1:30 in the morning in the Philippines to be with us. So thank you so much, Lau.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Rachel.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye.